We are having four very, very exciting speakers here on the quite intricately linked issues of biodiversity, health, and food security. And it's all coming up the political agenda. I had the pleasure of being in the German Federal Parliament day before yesterday on exactly that topic. So this is really what is of great interest now, not just to us as a scientific community, but also to policymakers. And I think things like the current war and other things have really highlighted and exacerbated the issues around these three interlinked issues. Global food security is threatened. We had a pandemic where our neglect of biodiversity and ecosystem functions leads to enormous issues with our health and our finance system. So it's all intricately linked, and I'm very, very pleased to see so many of you here in the audience. And we have four very, very exciting and distinguished speakers. We will start off with Lynn, who is a specialist on pollinator and agricultural systems, followed by Professor Ngo, who again working on similar issues of pollinator assessments and global assessments for IPBES, FAO, and others. Professor Niggli, who has for a long, long time been a strong advocate for ecological agriculture, but includes also technical innovations and solutions into the issues of food security. Then we will hear from Julia Heinz, who is a very smart PhD student here in Germany, working between University Osnabrück, TU Berlin, and the Wuppertal Institute. So you will hear from a number of very interesting perspectives, global, local, and from all spectrums of the career ladder, so to speak. And I think, again, that is very important to hear these different voices and perspectives from perhaps more experienced, but also young and eager people on these issues, because they affect us all, and they may or may not affect us all in different ways. So I would propose that we try to keep as much to time as possible. You know, with this internet stuff, it's all interlinked, not just the three issues we are talking about today. So please stick to your allotted 15 minutes or less. And perhaps I will try to intervene if you seriously overrun, but perhaps you also just go one after the other. Let's see how it's all going to work. So we will work, and we will start off with Lynn Dix. So over to you. Thank you, Lynn.
Okay, thank you very much. So let me just start this presentation for you all. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation to speak. I think you can see the slides now. So I'm going to talk about the impacts of pollinator decline on human well-being. And this comes from a group exercise that was published in Nature in Ecology and Evolution last year. If you want to look it up, the references are on the slides. But the starting point, I have to first say what we know about what's happening to pollinators. There's obviously a lot to say here, but I'm just going to give you a flavour with two of the best long-term data sets on wild pollinating insects in the world. The first one happens to be from the UK, and it's excellent because it's counted individual large moths in a network of light traps since 1968. And what we see from the latest analysis is that the number of moths is simply going down over time, pretty steadily. In fact, has declined by 33% since 1968. We have a less long-term but similar data set in terms of counting the actual numbers of insects for butterflies. Which is from 17 different butterfly species across Europe, a number of countries in Europe. And here you see an abundance index on the y-axis and the years since 1990. And it's not such a steady decline, but you see this decline over time. And in fact, it's 39% since 1990. So it's even greater decline in numbers. So we're facing this loss of numbers of insects And this is just butterflies and moths. We think it's also happening in bees and flies, but we don't have data to show the actual abundance of individuals in those. What most people would feel is that there's a loss of insects, and we have some excellent data on insect biomass from Germany, which some of you might be aware of, showing a very calamitous decline in the total weight of insects in a shorter period of time even. So this has been summarised by the IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And this diagram here on the left, which is very complex, is all of the different nature's contributions to people, one of which is pollination. And it's showing you what the 50-year global trend looks like when you take into account all the evidence on specified indicators. So for pollination and also dispersal of seeds, which is one of the things that small animals are involved in, it's one of the most strongly declining contributions, and it's one of the few with real certainty. So what these arrows here mean is that it's well established, there's high agreement and robust evidence that these key indicators of pollinator communities are decreasing. And the selected indicators are pollinator diversity and the extent of natural habitat in agricultural areas, which we know supports pollinator numbers and their diversity. So that's the background. Why should we care about this? These are tiny insects. And the stock answer is, well, because pollinators, mostly bees, but also lots of flies and beetles and wasps, and in some cases butterflies and moths, pollinate our food crops. 3/4 of the major food crops that are in the world depend on pollinators to some extent for their yield. And the food crops don't all depend to the same extent. So some are very dependent, some are less dependent. But if you add up all the numbers, it comes out that between 5 and 8% of human food by volume depends directly on pollination. And this map shows you the value in US dollars per agricultural hectare of those pollination benefits. So you can see in this map some very high value areas, over $250 per hectare in many parts of India, parts of China, around the Mediterranean, California, you can see here. And that is areas where there are high value crops grown in large areas with a moderate or strong dependence on pollination. So altogether, this adds up to hundreds of billions of US dollars a year, 200 to 600 or so annual market value that's linked directly to these small flying insects that live in the environment, or some of it is also delivered by managed honeybees. But there's some issues with the focus on crop pollination. One of the issues is that not all of the declining pollinators have a role in food production. So hummingbirds, for example, many of which are threatened with extinction, aren't really known for their food pollinator roles. Those butterflies and moths that I showed you at the start, there are a few crops that appear to be pollinated by butterflies and moths, but generally they're not delivering that contribution in the main in terms of food production. Another issue is that dependence on pollinators for food production is not the same as an actual impact of pollinator decline. Because if you are dependent, as for your livelihood, on pollinators, and those pollinators start to decline, you don't just sit back and let that happen. You adapt. And here's someone on the right here in China adapting to the loss of pollinators of pear trees by replacing that service by hand. And that's economically viable in some parts of the world. In fact, agricultural systems are taking decisive action to reduce this dependence on pollinators. So these are 3 reasons why we need to look a bit more deeply into this issue about pollinator decline and what it means for humanity. On this slide, I'm showing you an adapted version of the conceptual framework that the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services uses to illustrate the relationship between people and nature. So this is a kind of flow chart. You have nature at the bottom here, and that's, in this case of pollinators, that's the insects or the hummingbirds or the flower visiting animals that do the pollination service. And we know that some of those are declining, at least in some parts of the world. This feeds into what's called nature's contributions to people, also could be called ecosystem services. So things like pollination and the value to crop production that I've just talked about. That's a separate box from what's at the top here, which is the good quality of life, human well-being. And that's a recognition that people, in response to the nature's contributions to people, achieve a life that they value, have their health, have their social relationships, have their livelihoods. And in the middle here, you see the things that we can actually do to influence the good quality of life and the nature's contributions to people, and to change the drivers, which are the things that are driving the loss of nature. So habitat conversion, climate change, pollution, invasive species, all of those familiar drivers of biodiversity loss are in this box. And what's really important about this conceptual framework is that it separates out these institutional and indirect drivers, the global trade, the economic, the technological, as a separate set of drivers from the direct drivers. And I'm so sorry, my fire alarm is going off. That's a problem. I don't know if it's a test or whether I have to leave the building. I shall come out of here. You might have to move to the next talk because I think I have to leave my building. I'm so sorry. Oh no, it stopped. I'll return. I'm very sorry about that. Okay.
No problem, Lynn. Just continue for now.
Hopefully there's not a fire. I'm not usually in the office this early. I hope that doesn't happen every Tuesday, but I don't think so. Right, so I'll go back to here. So I was talking about the institutional and indirect drivers, which are separated out here. And what's important is that in order to change those drivers, you need to have a link where people are actually influencing the way that society is run, and you need this transformational change in the way we do business and the way we govern, and all of these really big things that are quite difficult to grapple. And this framework gives you a link between good quality of life, people's well-being, and these institutional drivers. So that's another thing that's quite important about that. That's all very, very broad thinking. But now I'm going to talk to you about the risks to human well-being from pollinator decline. So we know pollinators are declining and they cause a loss of pollination service. But what about this link here? And this is where you need some real interdisciplinary thinking in the research about how pollinator decline influences people's quality of life. So when we wrote the pollination assessment for the IPBES, we defined the broader impacts of pollinator decline on human well-being. And we actually listed 10 different things by 10 different ways that pollinator decline can affect human well-being. And these are just the direct ways. There's a whole load of other indirect ways that pollinator decline might affect humans, which I won't talk about anymore. So the 10 different things are, first of all, crop pollination deficit, which leads to loss of nutritional quality of food, for example, or availability of good quality, healthy food. But then you also have instability of crop yield, which has different impacts, honey production, long-term resilience of food production systems, yields of wild fruit, and availability of managed pollinators. And then you have these other impacts, which we grouped under biocultural diversity. And here you're looking at the simple loss of pollinator diversity itself as a loss to humanity, which is quite intangible and sort of indirect, because its real impact on human well-being is through this loss of aesthetic value or happiness, or loss of distinctive ways of life and cultural values. And you also might experience a loss of wild plant diversity as a result of pollination deficit. So these are the 10 impacts that we defined in the IPBES pollinators report, which is shown here. And a few years ago now, we ran an exercise to try to establish what the impacts of those, what the risk of those impacts is to human well-being based on expert judgment. So this is the group of experts. We were working with this global assessment of knowledge published by the IPBES on pollination and food production. And in this group of people, every global region is represented by at least 2 different people. And we followed a rigorous process of expert elicitation with several rounds, which I'll just very briefly describe. So we actually spent 2 days in a workshop all together going through this process. It's something called a modified Delphi process, because it iterates through rounds, but people's contributions are individually anonymized so that you reduce the impact of people's social status on what comes out. For each of those 10 impacts, we defined in each of the 6 global regions, we scored for the probability of this happening, the scale, how many people would be affected, and how bad it would be for those people. And we also all scored our confidence. And we went through rounds of scoring and then discussion and then anonymous scoring. This shady character here with the hat is illustrating that each scoring round was anonymous, so people didn't know how other people scored. And if the interquartile range was larger than 2, we discussed each thing again and we scored again. So this process allows you to get a score from a group of experts that brings together all their knowledge and is closer to the truth than if you just ask them in one round. The results I'll show you look in a format like this. So we calculated a risk score as in a very standard way as the probability times the severity times the scale after those 3 rounds of scoring. And we're going to plot them on a plot where probability is on the x-axis and scale and severity is on the y-axis. So you just have this increasing risk as you move from the bottom left to the top right. And we're also going to colour the impacts according to the confidence, which is based on a combination of agreement and robustness of evidence, and we have very clear criteria for working out how that is assigned, which you can see if you read the paper in Nature, Ecology and Evolution. So these are the results for the 6 global regions. You've got all the 10 impacts here with the letters. There's obviously a lot of detail in this, so I'm showing you the whole set of 6 global regions just to make 3 points about what we discovered from going through this process. The first thing, which is not very surprising to us, but it's worth pointing out, is that most of the dots here are unresolved or inconclusive, or a few of them are established but incomplete, which means that there's agreement but not particularly good evidence. Very few are well established, high agreement, good evidence. So there's a lot of uncertainty in what the impacts on human well-being are of pollinator decline. The second thing to point out is that the highest risk comes from this pole here, which is wild pollinator diversity. So we know that this is happening in a lot of places, and we can see these experts believed that there was severe impact or large impact on people of this happening. And the other one that's high in most of the regions is pollination deficit, which is this loss of crop production. So again, we know it's happening, the probability is high, the scale and severity is less high in some places, but higher in others. And the final thing that we noticed when we did this is that if you compare as a starting point Europe with Latin America or Asia Pacific, there's a fairly distinctive pattern here that the risks to human well-being are higher in the regions of the global south, which is something that we've been thinking about ever since. So just diving into a little bit more detail in the last minute or two, we found that the risks differ between regions, and one of the strongest differences is the risk of losing access to managed pollinators. This is MP on these diagrams, and it's not in the serious risk category for most of the regions, but it is for North America. And that's because honeybees in North America are a key input to large industrialized cropping systems, and they are having severe outbreaks of disease and pests, and there's been this colony collapse. So there is actually a clear, strong impact on people's livelihoods, whereas in Africa, honeybees are native and they're thriving in most places, and so there isn't such a perceived risk there, and it's a low probability of no access to honeybees. In South America, the honeybees are invasive and they're doing fantastically well, so there's a low probability of losing access to them, but the scale and severity of that loss would be similar to in North America. And the final point is looking at the loss of distinctive ways of life and cultural practices. And here you have, this is CV on these plots, so you have a moderate probability, but a moderate to high severity and scale of impact. And that's because these are things like people's relationships with honeybees, their cultural practices of beekeeping, this honey hunting that's going on in this picture here in Cameroon. This is considered by this group of experts to have a more severe impact on people's well-being than it is in Europe and North America, because we've somehow disconnected from those cultural practices is I think the thinking behind this. So the implications of this work are that there are some serious risks to human well-being from pollinator decline. Crop pollination deficit is one of them, but there are others as well. And there are important differences among the global regions, such as the risks associated with losing managed pollinators. Finally, the risks are generally lower in wealthier nations. Is this because economic development degrades the connection between nature and human well-being? And that's the question I'll leave you with. Thank you very much to all of the people who contributed to this work.
So do you see my presentation?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks for being here. It's a great pleasure because biodiversity and agriculture are so much linked, as we heard from Lynn's presentation, that it's extremely important aspect. So I will talk about the incentives for food and farming systems that benefit biodiversity. So I will talk about trade-offs in agriculture and food systems, different pathways for sustainable and biodiversity friendly food systems, and then come to the conclusion. We exactly know what biodiversity is, and for agriculture, it's especially important that we have the functional diversity on field level, we have within species diversity on farm level, and we have species diversity on landscape level. And agricultural policies worldwide destroy this biodiversity on all three levels. We talk about classical food trade-offs between food security and sustainability. And if we look at the planetary boundaries published by Steffen and Rockström, we see that the genetic diversity and probably also the functional diversity is threatened globally. And main reasons for that are agricultural activities, the number of people we have to feed, and this threat will increase because looking at the United Nations forecast for 2050, they calculate a food gap of 56% by 2050. That would mean even if we calculate a further increase of agricultural productivity, about 600 million hectares agricultural land additionally needed, 400 million hectares of grassland and 200 million hectares of cropland. And that's a disaster for climate change, but also for the further development of biodiversity. Therefore, according to the recommendation of the United Nations Food System Summit, we should manage the existing agricultural land sustainably, but also productively. And on the global level, there are two strategies. Like, one is sustainable intensification. That's a more technocratic approach to increase food production by reducing the negative impacts on ecosystem services and the environment. And the more holistic systems are called ecological intensification. So one might say that organic, regenerative, conservation agriculture, ecological intensification agriculture, agroecological practices, down to agroforestry systems can be summarized under this ecological intensification. The EU Commission, in its Farm to Fork strategy, has put emphasis on two ways to tackle with biodiversity losses. One is a strong reduction of chemical pesticide, minus 50%. Another one is a strong reduction of nitrogen fertilizers by 50%, and also increase the share of organic farmland at up to 25% by 2030. So globally, the share of organic land is only 1.5%. So this is a policy typical for Europe, but globally, the increase of organic land is not so relevant, especially in terms of biodiversity. So we know from a lot of studies that organic farming is quite a good strategy, a good system to increase or maintain biodiversity on farms. And there are so many studies showing that studies from plots, from fields, from farms, from landscape studies, that the major impact of organic farming on biodiversity is positive, and there are some negative cases, but there are also indifferent impacts which show that organic farming can still improve if we want to focus on maintaining biodiversity. And a study of our Swedish partners, and meta-analysis has shown that overall we can, with organic farming approaches and systems, we have a 30% higher abundance and a 30% higher diversity of many taxa. So it's the strategy of the European Union to increase organic farmland realistic. And we see here in yellow the growth up to 2020, and in blue the growth needed to achieve the 25% goal, meaning 40 million hectares. And it looks like being unrealistic to achieve this goal. And already the 2020 figures show that the actual the realistic growth is lower than the expected growth or the targeted growth of the EU Commission. And and what we see at the moment, that conversion rates from conventional production to organic farming has stopped at the moment because markets have strongly reacted to the global financial crisis, the energy prices, and the inflation. So at the moment, we see that this policy to support environmental goal by pushing organic farmland might fail, and this is a realistic expectation. But in addition to that, there is also another aspect, because organic farming has a significantly lower productivity per area. It ranges between 5 to 40%, depending on crops and depending on climate and site conditions. So Seufert and Ramakuti, they show that although the performance, and especially the environmental performance, biodiversity, but also other environmental performances of organic is very good per unit area, per land area, per unit, per hectare. But if you calculate it per ton of productivity, the performance is much lower, and this is one of the major problems of the organic strategy, meaning that basically we needed more land to produce the same amount of food. And there are fantastic examples how disastrous such a development could be. Here, the example of the Cuvette Centrale in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Their policy was to drain the wetlands of this Cuvette Centrale. This is an area of 40% of Germany. It's the biggest moorland in Africa, and training it would result in having a huge area with very productive farmland. And but the disaster would be that 30 billion tons of CO2 equivalents would become emitted, and that equals the emissions of the United States of the last 20 years. So Paris climate goals, forget about it, and it would become a disastrous loss of biodiversity. Fortunately, the government has slowed down this idea, but I think what I heard is that started again to debate about such a development. So this is not what we want what we want to achieve. So what is clear, and this was also a clear recommendation of the Scientific Advisory Board of the National Action Plan for Plant Protection in Germany, that the change in habitat quality, in landscape quality, the use of nitrogen and the use of pesticides are the three major impacts on biodiversity, because they really destroy these natural food nets. And so the recommendation here is that especially chemical crop protection should be substantially reduced as one major cause of biodiversity losses. There are other debates whether this could also be achieved by diet changes, so a reduction of meat consumption. And it's obvious that that most countries, most European countries, but for sure United States and Canada as well, have extremely high meat consumption per person and year. It ranges between 40 and 62 kilogram. But from a health aspect, 12.5 kilogram is the recommendation meat per person and year. So for health reason, a reduction of 70 to 80% would be the ideal solution. And this would remove the pressure on agriculture tremendously. And that's why, for instance, the study of Leclerc, he also recommended a reduction of meat consumption for bending the curve of terrestrial biodiversity. I think this is one of the most important strategy for the future. But there is also scientific evidence, because organic farming cannot be the only strategy, that agricultural diversification positively correlates productivity with ecosystem and natural resource maintenance. So therefore, diversification strategies in general could reduce trade-offs between these two goals. And there are so many diversification strategies which could be taken into account. So it's from biodiversity of landscape down to diversity of crops and food. So there are so many ideas, so many tools which could be taken up by agriculture, and especially agriculture policy, in order to increase the diversification in farm production. And so we exactly know what we could do. And it can be even upscaled, the diversification, on for very large scale agriculture. For instance, the digitalization, like precision farming, you see here as two examples. With precision farming, using GPS camera controlled soil sensors and so on, we can create monocropping systems with completely with a completely loss of biodiversity, but we could also create wonderful landscape. We could really paint the landscape, and we could considerably enhance biodiversity with in the soil, the terrestrial biodiversity and the landscape diversity. So these diversification strategies are not only possible for tiny farms, smallholder farms, but also for huge farms. So we have the technology. So the agroecology at the moment is seen by FAO as one of the major strategies for the diversification of farming systems. And this under agroecology, we can summarize a lot of different farming systems I have shown here. Organic farming is one part of it, and agroecology, as it is a more open approach to farming, it's not codified as organic farming. It's not regulated by do's and not do's. So it might be a more open approach to diversification, and some scientists even discuss whether in agroecological systems, the system approach, the diversification strategy could become combined also with modern technology. So it's a less restrictive, it's a more open system. So biodiversity in any case is, for farmers, it's also a question of risk management. So the diversity of landscape helps to regulate beneficial insects, pests. The diversity of structures of habitats has also a huge influence on pest management, for instance. Of course, diversity of species, and especially the diversity of crops or varieties via crop rotation and other approaches. So it is a risk management, a good risk management for farmers. Conclusions: trade-offs in agriculture and food systems there are a lot of trade-offs between productivity, sustainability, and so on. So, but there are different pathways for sustainable food system. Organic is a part of the solution. Agroecological farming, which might be an approach to be taken up by the other non-organic farmers, is a more open strategy, but both are very meaningful for the diversification strategy. And we have all the scientific evidence, the knowledge how to do it, the financial instruments, at least in Europe, Canada, United States, and partly in Asia, to support the diversification strategy. So let's do it. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you very much. Niggli. We should move straight to the next talk, I think.
Yeah, the next talk, please.
Slightly behind time.
So I am based right now in Raleigh, North Carolina. So it is 4 o'clock in the morning, but I was really excited to be a part of this conference. And I'd like to thank the organizers of the conference and the session for the invitation to present. My name is Hien, and I'm currently with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. At the same time, I'm part of this ORISE program supporting a US-led, congressionally mandated assessment on biodiversity and climate change. But I do not represent the US government. So I'm well placed to speak about the role of science policy interfaces or policy science interfaces in nature conservation. My talk will start out with an introduction about what science policy interfaces are. I'm glad that the sessions yesterday in the plenary and also today with Lynn's opening really talked about IPBES, so I don't have to go into that so much, but I'd like to go into the role of IPBES and IPCC and some concrete examples about how they've inspired and informed conservation and decision making. So it's very concrete that way. And then we'll look at the whole of society approach, reaching those conservation goals with a few concrete examples, again, on different scales. So what is the Science Policy Interface, or SPI? Well, here you have a definition by Van den Hove in 2007, which defined science policy interfaces as a social process, which encompasses relationships between scientists and knowledge holders and other actors in the policy process or decision-making process, and which allow for exchange, coevolution, and joint construction of knowledge with the aim of enriching or informing decision-making. So I don't really have to go over what IPBES is because we've had IPBES mentioned in several talks before, but it is the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Quite a mouthful, so I'll be using the acronym IPBES throughout my talk. It was established in 2012 and is an independent intergovernmental body of, I think, almost 140 member countries. The overall objective of IPBES is to strengthen the science policy interface for conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, long-term human well-being, and sustainable development through, again, informing decision-making. IPBES is in its second work program and has 4 functions that match up to each of the 4 objectives on the screen, including 2 additional objectives that were outlined in the second work program. So assessing knowledge, building capacity, providing policy support, and catalyzing the generation of new knowledge. And the 5th and 6th objectives are, of course, about communication and improving the effectiveness of the platform itself. I am most familiar with the assessing knowledge function. And I know both Alex and Lynn from the pollination assessment, which they've talked about previously. It was the first ever product of IPBES, and it was completed in 2016. I then went on to support the IPBES Global Assessment, which was released in 2019, and then a few more workshop and technical reports, which is the IPBES workshop report on pandemics and biodiversity, and also the latest one released in 2021, which was the first ever endeavor between the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, and IPBES. So the overall objective of IPBES is to strengthen that science policy interface. And you would ask, does it really fulfill its role and contribute to this process of decision-making towards conservation? Some people have actually come up to me in conferences and said, and have asked, well, does IPBES actually impact decisions or actions? And I'm here to tell you, yes, it does with its knowledge products and other functions. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. In 2019, the global assessment was released in May. And then late in that summer, the G7 environmental ministries got together in Metz and established the Metz Biodiversity Charter, which they really welcomed the global assessment as the underpinning to their commitments and actions on addressing main pressures of biodiversity. Also, later that year, the G7 Nature Compact was a commitment locking in agreements to protect, conserve, and restore biodiversity, as well as progress reports on these commitments to ensure tangible results by 2030. These together were also mentioned in the following G7 conference and the one after that. Also, starting in 2019 at the G20 meeting, they noted the important work of IPCC and IPBES within their communique. So they say, and they've also mentioned IPBES's chapter on assessing progress towards achieving sustainable development goals. And I just wanted to show you in this slide that every subsequent G20 after 2019 has mentioned the importance explicitly of IPBES. For example, in the G20 meetings in 2021 in Naples, they explicitly mention the workshop report on biodiversity and pandemics. And then they leveraged it by a commitment to integrate One Health approach and other holistic approaches in their relevant policies. And they also mentioned the IPBES IPCC co-sponsored workshop report and in implementing nature-based solutions or ecosystem-based approaches in key sectors of society. So that's just an example of how IPBES products have influenced decision-making on a global scale. Another example, and very relevant to this very conference, is the Convention on Biological Diversity's post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, GBF. And you might ask, how does IPBES inform that decision-making process? Well, this is a schematic, a figure that I've stolen from the CBD Secretariat or borrowed, and it really shows you how the member parties to this Convention on Biological Diversity use that evidence that IPBES has evaluated and assessed, including the pollination assessment, together with their national reports, together with thematic reports, other thematic reports and regional reports, to really inform the next strategic plan for the decade on biodiversity. So again, another concrete example of how IPBES has informed decision makers on a global scale. We are here now talking about the regional scale, and the EU Green Deal has been mentioned several times, farm to fork, in the previous presentation by Dr. Niggli. So here it states that the Commission's future work will be guided by evidence-based information and assessments, including those from IPBES and IPCC. So I find that these knowledge products are critical for the decision-making process, even at a regional scale. But governments are not the only ones to play an important role. Elizabeth Marema is the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity. In here, she really emphasizes that it's needed an integrated whole of government, whole of society approach to improving the way that we manage natural environment and interactions with human society. So this means not just governments, but non-state actors, including the private sector, citizens. They're all needed to safeguard biodiversity. This is a really neat example of how the finance sector was inspired to take action from the IPBES global assessment. So I'm not going to read all of these captions and bubbles here, but I'll point out a couple. They've committed to building an investment package. Sorry, I should note this is BNP Paribas, which is a French international banking group. And they cite the IPBES global assessment explicitly. So they want to build an investment package of $250 million by 2025 for startups mobilized in the ecological transition. They deployed training programs for almost 200,000 employees on social and environmental challenges. They're going to dedicate 55 million euros of new investments to the protection and restoration of natural capital. So you can see here that there's another sector that's using the evidence-based products that were done by IPBES to really mobilize some conservation action on their end. The next couple of examples are on a smaller scale. I wanted to show you a broad array of actors and also scale. This is a neat one, and maybe Lynn knows about it. The Cambridge City Council in 2019, after the IPBES global assessment, decided to declare a biodiversity emergency. and they pledged to work with partners and communities to reverse the decline of biodiversity and deliver measurable biodiversity net gain within Cambridge and the wider region. They also did something really neat within their declaration for actions, which was make an open spaces biodiversity toolkit, where they were installing bat boxes on trees and communal gardens, putting up insect hotels to support local insect populations. They were mounting trellises and planting honeysuckle to improve the aesthetics of communal areas and provide resources for pollinating insects. I think that's a really neat example of how IPBES, the Science Policy Interface, has impacted or inspired conservation action. This is an example of an individual level inspired conservation action. So this man, Anthony Lavelle, was very inspired by the global assessment. So he has a website on poetry regarding threatened species. And he cites the impetus or the inspiration as the IPBES global assessment. I'm getting to the end of my talk here, but Mary Ruckelshaus in the United States and some colleagues were really talking about this challenge of scaling down some of the policy options that were outlaid in the IPBES global assessment and how it can actually lead to action. And they outline a few key factors in having real action on the ground from something such as an assessment report. So you need actors to be deeply multidisciplinary. You need them to be in close engagement with dialogue with other partners, and you need to incorporate a diverse source of knowledge and ways of understanding in order to really stimulate significant long-term commitments from society actors and sectors. And then I like to end off with the theme of the pollination impacts here. And I think it ties in nicely to the previous two talks. Again, the IPBES pollination assessment, for which Alex and Lynn were a part of, was released in 2016. And that was really the scientific and knowledge underpinning to inform the Convention on Biological Diversity's second iteration of the International Pollinator Initiative and Plan of Action up to 2013 at their Conference of the Parties 14th session, which was in 2018. But at a national level, when I scale down and look at how the pollination assessment has impacted at lower levels, you see here an example of the assessment was used to develop the US National Pollinator Health Strategy for use by all government agencies, influencing the scientific direction and practical actions for crucial habitat protection with respect to pollinators. And then just recently, a couple of months ago, it was brought to my attention that even at state level, this pollination assessment has impacted some of their actions. So in Pennsylvania, they proposed a state-level task force that would aid the Department of Agriculture and other agencies in coming up with ways to increase the protection against the rapidly declining number of bees and other pollinators for Pennsylvania. So I hope I was able to show you with these examples and a quick briefer about science policy interfaces, how products of IPBES and other science policy interfaces are critical in the decision-making process and how their outcomes inspire conservation and action at all scales. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank a couple of conservation heroes of mine, which were involved in the assessments of IPBES, which I worked with, but have since passed away. They too have inspired conservation action with their work. So this is Bob Scholes and Georgina Mace. Thank you very much.
All levels, from the global to the local, can really make a difference. Very, very inspiring. I would like to hand over now to Julia to give us her presentation in a nice bistro environment Well chosen.
Thank you. Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I would like to thank that I can talk about my first results of my dissertation research. My overall goal is to quantify the biodiversity impacts of catering meals and empower stakeholders in the kitchen to have a sense what biodiversity is and to produce biodiverse meals. And for this, at first, I needed to give them a scientific sound instrument to evaluate the meals. Yeah, I'm going to start. So, as we already heard about the influence of food, I will not go into detail on this slide, as we all know about the effects that our food system has on the environment. Yeah, we already heard that the preservation of biodiversity is a basic requirement for our food systems, especially the intensification of land use and the increasing homogeneity between the food groups has a negative impact on agrobiodiversity. For example, if we look at the global calorie amount demand, 60% is right now covered with free crops, that is maize, rice, and wheat. And another factor is that the restrictions and the variety of the crops chosen to eat lies in social changes. For example, in Western society, we change the way we cook, our eating habits, and we have an increased demand for fast food and high convenience meals. And this demand is then passed on to the agriculture food trade. On the other hand, there is a lack of indicators that specifically assess the biodiversity impacts on the consumption level, and specifically on the level of ingredients or on the meal. And we all, we here know what biodiversity is, but there is a big lack of awareness for biodiversity, even in the stakeholders that I'm going to give you an insight of. So why the catering sector? I choose the German catering sector because it's the second most important sales channel after the food retail. And here I give you a brief overlook what the out-of-home consumption is. My key focus is on the core business catering and the community catering, which is then separated in business. For example, your kitchen at work, care, the hospital, and education. So it's school catering. And kitchens in the out-of-home contracts cannot just only reduce directly, for example, greenhouse gases by using different energy sources. It's a way to communicate sustainable meals, because, for example, if you have a positive taste experience with a sustainable dish, and then you maybe check the recipe, maybe find a new ingredients, and then transfer it to your meal planning at home, and then best share the meals with your partner or family or friends. So if we tackle the catering sector, we need to make small changes in the catering sector, but it has a big impact of a lot of people, even at home. Yeah, what was my goal and scope? As I already said, I had this goal to identify already available indicators and impact assessment methods to quantify the biodiversity impact of meals. And my scope was to find already available data that is scientific sound, and that this data needed to be enabled to the catering sector. So it had to be influenceable by the stakeholders in the kitchen. What I did was, at first, I did a big literature review, and then after that, I discussed and the already found assessments with experts. The expert I was talking to came from different work fields. For example, scientists who were having the focus on biodiversity in farming or organic farming. Then I talked to life cycle assessment specialists who were modeling impacts on biodiversity in LCAs. And then I did interviews with experts in the out-of-home catering, and especially experts in sustainability in out-of-home catering. Based on both methods, I had quantitative and qualitative results. The findings on the quantitative sides were the life cycle assessment. Life cycle assessment is already used for the years to identify impacts in, for example, the supply chain, or here identify hotspots in the biodiversity. I assessed different assessments, and I came up with two of them. Both approaches refer to the land use intensity in 804 ecoregions of the WWF, and through this can represent the cultivation of crops and make it more comparable worldwide. So it can then transfer to the influence per crop, which is cultivated in different countries, and can then best be selected by the stakeholders in the kitchen. As Mr. Niggli already mentioned, there are other assessments. For example, the organic crop production. As I said, we heard from Mr. Niggli that organic food cultivation is more biodiverse friendly than the conservation cultivation, but there is no common assessment right now on it. That's why I put it on the category qualitative assessments. On the other hand, we have the share of ingredients on the menu that could come from old animal breeds or crop varieties. As Mr. Niggli already mentioned, the diversity of crops and food is really important for the agrobiodiversity. That's why I came up, as I call it, the colorful plates to colorful fields idea of the assessing of the share of the most widely grown and consumed crops. As I already told you, the starchy ingredients could be replaced with other, and then have a nice colorful plate, which then the customers have a positive reaction to, and it's already good, understandable for the kitchen staff and the stakeholders. So my conclusion is that you can combine different approaches. Quantitative assessment can be, as I show here, can be transferred to a scheme in, for example, Microsoft Excel, which then the stakeholders can use, and then put the recipes in and see the hotspot ingredients, and then manipulate those and maybe change it or change how many grams on the menu. And this tool can be also supplemented with qualitative assessments. I saw that the stakeholders need training to understand the factors of influencing biodiversity. That's why I'm working with them in a process where they already give me feedback, tell me where are the strengths and limits of the scientific data. Yeah, that's why I need to go further with my research, compare those quantitative methods, pick one, weight the indicators, especially the qualitative ones, and then deduct thresholds. And right now I'm evaluating some of the menus. And here we can already see some limits. For example, we can see if we propose land where a crop should come from, the stakeholders hasn't always been able to look it up on the back, for example, of the product. So that's a first bummer in the research. My key message is that the out-of-home catering market is the right place to go into detail for sustainable consumption, although it has a big lack of orientation, what is sustainable or what is contributing to biodiversity conversation. An assessment tool can be a first step in the practical use to implement or to create an understanding of what biodiversity is, what are the hotspot ingredients used in the catering sector. For example, we talked a lot of cacao, and that's an ingredient which is just used on a minimal scale. Yeah, that's are my sources, and thank you so much for your attention and that I could talk about this topic.
Great, thank you, Julia.
Fantastic work, and so great to see that you want to have a sector-wide input. It is, to me, all a bit bizarre that on the one hand, we in
Johannes, we lost you.
dramatically, and in the south, they are facing hunger and wanting to destroy ecosystems in order to feed themselves. It's a quite upside down, topsy-turvy world, and it's so good to see what smart approaches all the speakers have brought to facilitate that change, and also how we are all trying to interact with policy in order to get minds and perhaps also resources shifted. So are there any issues that the speakers want to challenge or discuss with each other?
I think we have quite a few interesting questions that have been discussed in the chat that we could bring up. We've got 15 minutes, haven't we, for discussion?
Yeah.
So one thing that I thought was interesting was that from Professor Niggli's talk, there was a question about what we do with the European Union's promotion of organic farming. When you so well describe this issue about the trade-off with production level and what that does when you look at it at a global scale. If we go to a lower yield, is it right that the EU is promoting organic farming and increasing the area of that?
Yeah, I think this is quite an important issue, but the promotion of organic farming up to 20 to 30% is not problematic, I think, because it can be combined with food waste reduction easily, and it can be combined with feeding less cereals, less concentrates to animals, meaning that we change the consumption to less to eat less meat, and especially to eat less pork and chicken meat, because they completely depend on cereals. So there are many ways for compensation, and I think that having much more organic farmers is important, because organic farmers is basically a school, a training camp for learning how systems work, agricultural systems. And that's why it's a fantastic, they are all fantastic examples that we need to establish again diversified farming systems, and all the farmers can learn from that. That's why I think that up to 20-30% organic farming is not a problem and will not harm global food security.
Alex?
Just to pick up on this, was Niggli, can organic farming stay as it is, or do we have to improve the organic farming system? You mentioned GMO crops, also for organic. Is this risky, or do we have to change the system? Because I'm kind of skeptical that we can go so high and we are not including more, let's say, more regulations for the organic farming. Also, the landscape is not yet included in organic farming. It's mainly about pesticide reduction, and I agree, this is not easy, but we have to include more, like landscape issues and so on.
Yeah, that's also a very important question. It's clear that organic farming, as it is regulated at a minimum level, there are many, many deficits. You mentioned landscape level, the promotion of on-farm diversity, the promotion of in-field diversity. So all this is not really regulated, and organic farming can be considerably improved, so that biodiversity, but also climate change aspects are better targeted. That's extremely important. So there is a lot of improvement needed also for organic farmers, but organic farmers are usually open to such improvements. The other question is whether we should integrate more technologies, and I'm open. I'm discussing that very openly, because I think that in breeding we have organic breeding, and we have the modern, the novel biotechnology breeding, like CRISPR-Cas and so on. And as according to the scientific state of art, these novel breeding technologies do not affect negatively human health nor environment. So and it might be the fastest way to reduce to make crops resistance to pests and diseases, and this has definitely a huge impact on biodiversity, and also to produce more has also a high impact on biodiversity, because you use less land. that was originally my strategy. But it's clear that the organic movement, they cannot accept such novel technologies. This is a market problem. It's also a political profile. And so that's why I'm working now more with conventional farmers in order to combine many excellent approaches of organic with novel technologies for all farmers. And so 30% organic in Europe and 70% agroecological farmers. That would be an asset for European biodiversity.
Thank you. I wonder whether, Julia, the indicators that you're looking at for looking at the biodiversity impact of food take into account these different farming systems. Do you have scores for organic and conventional or not?
Yeah, as I already mentioned, it is said in the data that organic farming is better than conventional, but there is still to this day no common assessment how to tackle that. For example, the one indicator I showed by Lynn is over the land use intensity. So I could imagine that if you set a better land use intensity level, it can be incorporated. But it has to be tested, because you can say if you have, for example, on the HVOB levels, that a level 3 is half better than level 6. For example.
So I think that there's a trade-off, isn't there, between land use intensity and land area being used, and organic farming only looks good if you just look at the farm scale, but it can, from some angles, it can look quite bad.
Yeah, it depends on the country. Yeah, it depends on the country, as Mr. Niggli already mentioned. Sometimes you need more land, but it depends where you grow your crops. So that's the problem.
Yeah, that's also important. For instance, in subsistence agricultural systems, like in sub-Saharan Africa, there with organic you can increase yields, but globally the figures show that overall we have a decrease of productivity.
Alec, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I just want to ask something for the food system, again to Julia. I think the consumer at the moment has no choice to choose for biodiversity-friendly food system, because we don't get the information. We're going to a supermarket and we get no information at all. Sometimes we get few information, but not related to biodiversity. Why do we not create something like a code, something like this? I think in Switzerland you have something like this, not related probably for biodiversity, but this could be implemented. Would these not be very simple solutions in order to inform consumers?
Yeah, for example, in Switzerland, you have a label already. It's called Ladybug Marienkäfer. And it shows the consumer which product is more biodiverse friendly than the other one. But I think it's a great idea. But on the other hand, consumers are already overwhelmed by the labels on the products. So for this, either we choose one label for everything, or the product will be covered in labels soon. And for organic farming, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, for example, in Germany, you have like, I think 4 or 5 different labels just for organic farming, and all of these different groups have a different impact on the environment or the biodiversity itself. For example, the Bioland is the only label who has his own biodiversity strategy, but just for German crops. So it's not worldwide produced.
I think we need to be very careful here. There is a very strong tendency by industry and policy to push all of the responsibility down to the consumer, including reading the labels.
Yeah, I wanted to tackle this too.
If we fall all into that trap, we are just exacerbating the problem. I think regulation and norms to prevent this type of destructive behavior, we can't do it any other way. We cannot appeal to the good sense of humans. It needs to be done through strict regulation and preventing industry from being able to profit in a non-sustainable system from destroying the environment any further. Everything else, I think, is, as Guterres described, the road down to climate hell. And it cannot be pushed down to the consumer. It's ridiculous, and we shouldn't play that game. We really shouldn't.
Sorry. You're right. That wasn't my point. I just wanted to tackle the crowded label. My point is in my research to check what is the science say and what is on the other hand the stakeholders in the kitchen doing, and if can Germany can have a biodiverse catering, or is the system already crooked and we cannot choose, for example, biodiverse crops or something like this? So I'm always checking what policy needs to do, and at the end of my research, I want to come up with a policy paper.
Let's get a few other voices in. So Hien, very interesting what you have been saying, but how broadly is it actually understood in the scientific community that different perspectives need to be taken into consideration? It's much easier said than done. You know, I've wrote an article about it in 2012 in Nature, and I haven't seen in the last 10 years big pieces of science shifting to allow perspectives coming in. In fact, actually, the German academic system has just basically recommended a very cautious approach to participation. So these rearguard actions and basically defensive behavior seems to be the norm rather than the desired future.
Thanks for the question, and I get to tout a little bit more about IPBES. So you're talking about the participation and inclusion of different voices in processes such as this. So IPBES is different from IPCC in that it actually explicitly says across all of its functions and objectives that there should be a wide diversity of knowledge systems and voices. So even in the conceptual framework that Lynn had showed, that schematic, the simplified schematic, really it was done that way and diverged a little bit from previous frameworks to emphasize different voices. And all of IPBES's work involves having Indigenous peoples and local communities participations in the task forces, in the assessments. Also, social sciences and the humanities. There was an article that was done by the executive secretary, Anne-Larry Goddard, in Science, really asking for that sector of disciplines to be involved, that area of disciplines to be involved. And then finally, culminating this year was the finalization of the IPBES values assessment, which really hammers home the importance in all decision-making processes, how values have been considered in the past and need to be in the future, not prescriptive, but as options. So it was a really good question, really on point. I think SPIs, science policy interfaces, are moving in this direction of really getting inclusion from different voices as a key part.
Good. Okay. Well, I would still say we need to double, triple, or whatever our efforts there, not just talk about it, but also demonstrate it and show it. I think in that respect, as we are going to finish in 20 seconds, I think we all could have talked for another 5 hours or so. Congratulations. Thank you for your hard work in your respective fields. Let's work together to get the change we need. And thank you very much for everybody for their contribution. Okay, thank you.